If you want to understand whether American institutions still have the capacity to restrain power when it turns inward, you need to slow down and pay close attention to what follows. This is not a political flare-up. This is not partisan noise. This is a live institutional stress test, one that exposes how the system reacts when a president collides with limits imposed by his own party and refuses to acknowledge them. Here is the moment that triggered everything. According to multiple reports, Donald Trump picked up the phone and called a United States senator from his own party, not a Democrat, not a media adversary, a Republican senator. And this was not a discussion. There was no persuasion, no negotiation, no effort to build agreement. There was shouting, profanity, direct personal pressure. Let me pause here, because this matters. A sitting American president berated a member of his own party for voting to limit his war-making authority. The senator on the receiving end of that call was Susan Collins. Her offense was not disloyalty, it was institutional resistance. She supported a resolution designed to constrain the president's ability to initiate military action without congressional authorization. That vote was not symbolic, it was structural. And Trump's response was not argument, it was intimidation. This is where the context becomes unavoidable. Washington has seen ugly moments before, harsh phone calls, private pressure campaigns. None of that is unprecedented. What makes this episode different is the sequence surrounding it. For the first time in decades, Republican senators did not stop at issuing statements of concern. They acted, legislatively, in coordination with Democrats, to block the president's military authority. This is not performative dissent. This is not Washington theater. This is resistance with teeth. Picture Capitol Hill after dark, office buildings mostly silent, phones lighting up across Senate suites, staffers sending urgent messages. Senators refreshing vote tallies because what they're seeing clashes with every assumption about party discipline. The president isn't attacking the press. He isn't attacking the opposition. He's attacking his own party, and this time, they don't retreat. That is the break. Because when lawmakers move from rhetorical discomfort to binding legal action, the meaning changes. This stops being a policy disagreement. It becomes an internal intervention, a recognition that informal loyalty has failed and that legal guardrails must be activated. This is the point where individual behavior gives way to institutional response. A president encounters a constitutional limit and reacts with fury instead of persuasion. The system answers not with silence, not with compliance, but with resistance. That exchange tells you more about the condition of American governance than any campaign speech ever could. And in this opening phase, something unexpected happens. Pressure is applied. The system absorbs it, and it does not bend. What comes next is where the consequences move beyond symbolism and into structure, and that is where the stakes quietly become far higher than most people realize. What followed that rupture was not noise. It was motion, institutional motion. Republicans and Democrats moved together to advance a war powers resolution, not as protest, not as signaling, as law. A formal mechanism designed to prevent a president from initiating military action without explicit congressional authorization. This is the system's emergency brake, rarely touched, almost never pulled against one's own side. Pause here, because this is where gravity enters. Members of the president's own party looked at his conduct, his language, and the trajectory of his power and reached a blunt conclusion. Informal trust had failed. The calculation was stark. Legal guardrails must be installed before something irreversible happens. That is not disagreement. That is risk containment. And Trump did not respond like a president encountering oversight. There was no outreach, no clarification, no attempt to persuade wavering senators. According to reports, there was fury. He called Susan Collins and unloaded profanity, threats. Her vote was treated not as a constitutional act, but as a personal betrayal. Pressure replaced argument. Intimidation replaced explanation. Stop and sit with that. When a leader responds to constitutional limits with rage, They reveal how they understand power, not as authority delegated by law, not as something shared within a system, but as something owned, personal, untouchable. That belief that power is private property is what ignited the revolt. And it did not come out of nowhere. For months, Trump had publicly floated the possibility of using military force to acquire Greenland. At first, it sounded unserious, easy to dismiss, something that would normally vanish under scrutiny. Except it didn't. It was repeated, in public, on camera, without retreat. This is where institutional alarms began to ring. Greenland is Danish territory. Denmark is a NATO ally. And as Chris Murphy laid out on the Senate floor, Article 5 of NATO is not metaphorical. It is binding. An attack on one member is treated as an attack on all. Let that land. If the United States used military force against Greenland, it would not merely confront Denmark. It would be attacking the NATO alliance itself. That is not leverage. That is alliance fracture. That is the United States, in theory, triggering collective defense obligations against itself. This is not normal. This is not tough negotiation. This is not strategic ambiguity. This is the kind of rhetoric that forces institutions to prepare for scenarios they should never have to prepare for. Republican senators understand this. Many sit through classified briefings. They have watched crises escalate in hours, not weeks. They know how quickly miscalculation turns into mobilization. They understand that when an American president speaks, allies and adversaries recalibrate instantly and permanently. This is where worldview collides with reality. Trump approaches geopolitics as transaction. Every interaction is a deal. Winners and losers, assets to acquire, pressure to apply. That logic may function in real estate. It does not function in international security. Countries have militaries. Alliances have tripwires. Threats, once issued, cannot be recalled. Words become conditions. That is why Congress reached for the War Powers Act, legislation born from Vietnam, designed to stop presidents from dragging the country into conflict without consent. It exists as a final break on unilateral war-making. And here is the unprecedented moment. Republicans activated it against their own president. There is no modern parallel for that. The phone call to Collins was never really about one vote. It was about how resistance is processed. Trump didn't see democracy functioning. He saw defiance. But intimidation failed. Collins did not reverse her vote. Neither did the other Republicans who crossed the line. That failure matters. Because it revealed something Trump's political model depends on but cannot guarantee, loyalty is conditional. It lasts only as long as mutual benefit exists. When loyalty carries nothing but risk, alliances collapse. And while this confrontation unfolded, another lever was pulled. Trump declared a national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil assets. On the surface, it sounded like energy policy. Look closer. The timeline for benefits stretches years. The infrastructure costs are enormous. The primary beneficiaries are multinational corporations, not American consumers. So why an emergency? Because emergencies concentrate power. They bypass oversight. They shift authority away from Congress and toward the executive. They are meant for imminent danger, not strategic convenience. And a pattern becomes visible. Each time scrutiny tightens, a new crisis appears. This is where quiet oversight becomes the real threat. While attention focused on war powers, Sheldon Whitehouse began asking procedural questions about delayed documents, missed deadlines, Inspector General compliance. These are not accusations. They are pressure points. And pressure points generate paper trails. And as one line cuts through all of this, clean and cold, records are stubborn things. They don't vanish. They accumulate. They wait. And that is where this collision stops being about personality and starts becoming about whether institutional memory still has teeth when power tries to outrun it. What Republican senators are reacting to now is not a personality. It's a precedent in motion. And this is where historical gravity quietly takes hold. Constitutional norms do not heal on their own. Once they are bent, they don't spring back when the moment passes. They linger, they settle, they harden into usable tools. The shortcuts taken by one president do not vanish with the next election. They remain on the shelf, ready for reuse. That is the anxiety driving this revolt. Emergency declarations deployed to bypass Congress. Military threats aimed at allied nations. Oversight redefined as obstruction rather than accountability. Any one of these can be dismissed in isolation. Together, they form a pattern that reshapes expectations about how power is allowed to behave. That is why what you're seeing is not ideological, it is structural. This isn't about whether lawmakers like the president. It's about whether the Senate will still function as a co-equal branch a decade from now if these precedents are allowed to stand. Here is the question being asked quietly in Republican offices right now, not for cameras, not for headlines. If this isn't stopped now, will it even be possible to stop it later? Because the consequences don't remain theoretical. When war rhetoric escalates, military families feel it first. Deployments aren't abstractions, they're orders. When foreign policy becomes unpredictable, workers feel it. Supply chains break. Contracts vanish. Jobs disappear. When allies lose confidence in American commitments, markets react. Security arrangements weaken. Trust erodes not in a single collapse, but incrementally, decision by decision. That's how institutional damage actually unfolds. Not with one dramatic rupture, but through accumulation. So the real focus now isn't what already happened, it's what follows. Does the War Powers Resolution gather enough support to survive a veto? Do oversight requests continue moving forward or quietly suffocate in procedure? Does the coalition of Republicans willing to say no expand or remain isolated? Does presidential rhetoric escalate further with more emergencies, more loyalty tests? And what happens to the lawmakers who refuse to bend? Are they punished or do they endure? Those answers will determine whether resistance is viable and at what cost. At minimum, 3 things are now undeniable. The revolt is real, emergency powers are being weaponized, and precedent outlives personality, which leaves the system facing a question it can no longer avoid, and there is no safe way to answer it. Is the American constitutional framework strong enough to restrain a leader who does not believe restraint applies to him?